My name is Oliver Torres, Oliver Torres. I am 29 years old. I identify as Cuban-American. My mom's from Cuba and my dad is from Chile. And I am outreach paralegal with the Southern Poverty Law Center with our immigrant rights project. And I'm based out of Miami, but my advocacy focuses on Florida and generally the Southeast in the United States. And I advocate for immigrants, for all immigrants, regardless of where they came from, whether they came from Cuba, whether they came from Chile, whether they came from an African country, advocate for all of them. So I grew up surrounded by immigrants. Everyone I knew had an immigrant story. In college, I studied education. And I believed that education was the key to social change because if we empower each other, if we empower the youth, social change is inevitable, is where I came from. While working with various immigrant populations in Rhode Island, where I went to school, I felt powerless. So many immigrant families came to me in my different capacities. I worked in after school and summer programs. I worked in a front office. So I was in a space where families confided in me. Most of them were Latino. I worked in the very heavily Hispanic area of Providence. And a lot of their stories resonated with me. Seeing a certain mom or certain dad struggle financially and do everything possible to advocate for their child so that their child could get the best education in this country and so that their child could have every opportunity that they gave up by coming to this country. That story resonated with me because it's what my parents did. My mom and dad met in Cuba in med school. My mom became a dentist and my dad became a doctor, a general doctor in Cuba. And they decided to give up everything, to give up their careers, to have my family in the US. And so the stories of those families, they hit home. It felt like one of these families, if anything had gone slightly wrong, those families could have been my family. Or they reminded me of the families I went to school with, I grew up with, right? And so when they talked about a 7-year-old's dad potentially getting deported, I felt powerless. When they talked about not knowing if they were going to have a home next month because they were going to be evicted, I felt powerless. When they had none of the child's teachers spoke Spanish, and I felt a deeper connection to the community. And I felt that education wasn't the right place for me to be an advocate, that when individuals came to me and asked me to be an advocate, I would be better equipped to advocate for them. And so that's what took me to SPLC, to work with the Immigrant Rights Project. I wanted to explore multiple avenues for advocacy, and how could I do justice to the community that I came from? And even though not all of these people come from Cuba or come from Chile, we're still one community. We all identify with each other. We grew up together. We told stories to each other, right? Our moms are all, can all be the crazy Latina moms, yelling at us about the same things. And so in lots of ways, we're more alike than we are different. People like to disconnect themselves from the immigrant narrative. I think that's what's most painful, and that's what makes it most difficult. That people don't realize how the struggle that this family is experiencing right now is probably a struggle that your own family experienced, maybe a couple decades ago, maybe 2 generations ago. And people not realizing that a lot of times they just want, families are coming over here because they do want their kids to have access to a high quality education. They want what's best for their kids. And we all share the same values, but for some reason, or a lot of us share very similar values, but for some reason the narrative is twisted, right? That a lot of people who are coming over are lazy, or they're murderers, right? Or they're rapists. And it feels really easy for politicians to place all the blame on these new people coming over. Um, and it's really easy for folks who have been here for a couple decades to accept that narrative and be like, oh, yes, I am struggling now after I've been here for a couple decades because of these new arrivals. And so that's been the biggest struggle. It's seeing that, folks thinking that there's a fundamental difference in being a human between folks who have been here for decades and folks who have been here for months. And that's just not the case. There is not a fundamental difference. And if there's any way for folks to accept that that difference doesn't actually exist, that we're creating that barrier, that would make my work a lot easier.